just wanted to, everybody hear me? Just give me the thumbs up. Other than Joseph, who has a cat who's giving a thumbs up, but I hear ya. Okay, great. Yeah, okay. So we have quiz three coming up next. Well, hold on a second. Yeah, that's a week from today. Um, I think I would like to push that off by a week, if that's okay with everybody. Um, I just, I'd rather you finish lab one. Make sure, since the due date is here, I really should have put it here, I think. So, um, I'm going to make a change to the calendar and republish it if there's no objections. Now that's going to make this an open period. I could cover some, I'm going to move things around a little bit, I think. Um, yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to reorganize this a little bit just to make it a little more optimized in terms of not messing up VMs at a bad time, so just a heads up that that's coming. But today, I'm going to finish up the lectures for this lab, which DNS is the last lecture I have on this topic. And this is probably timely because some of you are probably trying to figure out why messages aren't working one way or the other, you know? So before I get started, I'm going to talk about DNS, but is there any burning questions about mail server? All right. You'll ask later. Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Let's do this thing. Okay. So I do want to poke around a little bit just to give a bit of a demo. So I've got my VMs kind of slowly calming down on my generation 4 Intel infrastructure. So it should be ready to go by the time I'm done this. But what I want to talk about is, the DNS hierarchy. So that's a review. I expect you understand that pretty well already. Understanding how forwarding works, which is a bit iffy because I know people have been a little unclear on forwarding in the past. Uh, Modifying the Linux bind in Windows DNS servers. So once we get them working, then we have to reconfigure them so that we can fake out real DNS out in the real world and just answer all the questions internally, right? And then differentiate between the DNS service and the DNS client on Edgeron, okay? And how those aren't the same thing at all, right? And so they can operate completely independently. And then we get down in the nuts and bolts of testing configurations and how you can do that. Okay, so DNS is crucial to mail functionality. It really doesn't work with IP addresses. Okay, it does up to a certain point, but it doesn't scale well. So we're really dependent on DNS. And if we do that wrong, things don't get delivered. Okay. So we are pulling off a little bit of a sleight of hand, a little bit of a trick to get our servers to accept that our domains are legitimate, right? Like, so our internal LAN, it already thinks it's Enron, right? But we have to get MailBuddy to think that it's Enron too. It has to think that Edgeron is Enron. Edgeron has to think that MailBuddy is the real MailBuddy, you know? So we've got to get them all believing this kind of, mass conspiracy theory, essentially, right? The idea here is we want to short circuit queries to external servers like 8.8.8 or 202.2, okay? Because they're not going to give us the answer that we want. There's a real Enron out there. There's probably not a real mailbuddy.com, but who knows? But it's those external servers will give the actual response, and we're trying to kind of create this illusion. Now, the illusion that we're creating, that's not like it's not real DNS. That's how real DNS works. You know, if you own a domain, you set up a DNS server that's authoritative for it. The only thing with us is that we're stealing that, right? So we can't go out on the internet and have the whole world accept us. But what we're doing with DNS is exactly what you would do. to get DNS to function in your environment. Okay. So DNS is hierarchical. This is the summary part here. So we got the hierarchy up at the top. There's the root. That's the period in the, when you're looking at, say, bind files, that's what the period means. So enron is a subdomain of com, which is a subdomain of the root, right? At the root, we've got those 12 or 13 servers, which are basically keeping track of all of the top level domains, right? And they're kind of saying, yeah, you can go there for any com stuff, you can go there for any org stuff, and then it goes down through the hierarchy, right? So down to Enron, and then you get to a host of some type. So upstream servers, the idea here is that they don't want to spend a whole bunch of time answering queries from random Joe Windows 10 client, right? So when we're actually using Google's 8.8.8, they're probably like, you know, not really, but I'm sure they have the beef to handle it, but it's really not the way that it's intended to be done. The hierarchy is meant to be respected so that you query your own DNS server and it will handle queries for everybody else, right? So anybody underneath it. And then it will cache answers so that it's not constantly bugging, say, 8.8.8.8. Okay. So if a DNS server is authoritative for a particular zone, so when you create a domain controller, it's always authoritative for that domain name, right? So enron.com, for example, then it doesn't need to go out and query any further. And so that's a way of short-circuiting any going out to the internet, right? At the same time, that DNS server is only authoritative for a limited number of zones. And so often just one, but sometimes more. Okay. So if it doesn't have the answer locally, then it has to know where to go to fetch an answer. Okay. Since it's doing it on behalf of all the clients in its network. So the way you do that is you configure your forwarders. Okay. You could do a secondary DNS server, but forwarders is the real way to go. And that's the idea is if I don't have the answer to the question, then I'm going to go to this next, this next step up the hierarchy. Okay. So our internal enron.com domain works because it's the start of authority for enron.com from its own perspective, and all of the clients accept that because they're part of the domain. Okay. So it's not going to pass those upstream, those queries upstream. Any other query, typically it will, unless it has a cached answer. Okay. So caching can be a confusing factor, especially when you're troubleshooting, because you may have something that's not working right, and then you fix it, and you think everything should work well, but you're still getting bad answers. It's a cache issue, sometimes. Um, Proxies also get in the way. So there's a caching proxy on the Linux server, 127.0.0.53. If you think about it, 53 is the port that DNS runs on. This is a caching proxy server which handles client requests on the Linux system. Okay. It's not your actual DNS. All it does is it caches answers. Okay. Your actual DNS is 192.168.202.15, right? And so what can happen on Linux is that your caching proxy server 127 may not be configured properly to actually query 192.202, 192.168.202.15. And if it doesn't, it might go out to the outside world, and that can give you weird answers as well. Okay. So we do go through that in the exercise, but if there's anything wrong with that, like for example, if you keep a comment in place where you shouldn't have a comment, or if you didn't reload the service, things like that, then you're going to get junk answers. The other thing is, if the cache information hasn't expired, you could still be getting junk answers. Okay. Okay, so a DNS server is placed in the DNS hierarchy through its use of forwarders. The forwarder is the next step of contact up the chain, right? There can be multiple forwarders in a list, with the first one being the go-to. Okay, other forwarders are only consulted if, in the case of a failure, and by failure, I mean failure to contact, not the server coming back and saying, this doesn't resolve to a domain name. So it coming back with a negative answer is not a failure. Okay. It's the lack of an answer, which is a failure, in which case then it can go down the list of forwarders. Okay. So the forwarder becomes responsible for finding the answer to the query that's been passed on from it. And it will then either have the answer or it will go and consult its forwarder. And so that's how we move up the chain of the DNS hierarchy. Okay. So this continues until an answer is found or until it's pretty clear that there is no answer, which is a type of answer. Okay. So if you get up to the root and you're not being directed to anything else, then the game is over, you know? So let's say this is on my DC. If I go into the forwarders tab of the DNS management service, right? Here, I just put Edgeron, and that's what we're going to be doing to fake out DNS within our environment. Okay, so we're standing up a DNS server on Edgeron, and it's going to claim to be authoritative for Edgeron and MailBuddy. Okay, now that's not strictly true, but it's true enough to allow us to get them to talk to each other. So the idea here, well, you'll see it in a second, but the idea here is that my DC, if it can't answer a query, it's going to go to Edgeron. Okay. Now, if any of my clients internally within the domain, if they make a request about an Enron entity, the DC feels that it's authoritative, so it's not going to go to its forwarder, right? Which means that any kind of answers that Edgeron would give for Enron aren't ever going to show up for clients. The clients will just trust the internal LAN. Okay. On the other hand, MailBuddy is also going to use Edgeron as its forwarder. When MailBuddy makes an Enron query, it's not going to look, it's going to look at its own DNS, but it's going to say, I don't control enron.com. So what's my next step? I'm going to go to the forwarder. Okay. And the forwarder is Edgeron. So MailBuddy does accept the answer from Edgeron. DC doesn't. Okay. Both of those are lies, right? But, this is also how it can be configured in the real world. Okay. Now, you'll notice this little check mark here, use root hints if no forwarders are available. Sometimes if your forwarder can't be reached and this is enabled, you're going to get a response from the outside world. Okay. What that usually means is that there's, for some reason, you're not able to query your forwarder. And so because you can't query it at all, it's going to go to the root and it's going to give you some kind of external IP address. Okay. So that's something to watch out for. Okay, so Linux is also running its version of a DNS server, and this is Bind, the Berkeley Internet Name Domain, which I think, they mangled the grammar just to make a good acronym, really. It's not even a backronym. They just like twisted it to make it work. Uh, Now, most of the root servers in the world are running Bind, okay? Not within the enterprise, but outside on the internet, right? So there are other DNS services, but they're less commonly used. There was one that was made specifically to add a little bit of variety to the root servers. And I don't know how you get that in order to run it if you want to. But that's because Bind has a long history. It's well respected, but it's also very well known for having security issues. Okay. Took us a long time to figure out how to secure this stuff, even though maybe it shouldn't have. So now we use Bind to manage the mailbuddy.com domain on our Linux mail server. It's a very standard service to work with in Linux. It's something that it's good to understand. And the way that it works, as you know now, probably it's all flat text files. So you're just configuring files. They're a little bit picky, so you got to watch out for a few things. If you have a tab in the wrong place, that can be a problem. If you have a comment in the wrong place, obviously that can be a problem. If you don't reload, the service after you make changes, that can be a problem. If you don't update the serial number in your zone file, that can be a problem. Okay. So you do have to be a little careful, but the reason all of that exists is so that you don't do a fat finger typo kind of issue and cause an even bigger issue, right? So most tasks they do involve editing the text files, but they make sure that you're rather intentional about it. So we go to varcache bind to find the zone files, at least in this version of Linux. Okay, that's not always the case. There are different locations depending on the distro that you use. So in this case, what we're doing, varcache bind db.mailbuddy.com, that's just a flat text file, right? So that has the start of authority information for the zone and any DNS records that we want to set up. Okay. So when you're setting up an A record, MX record, you'll indicate what they are. Okay. Like I said, serial number can be an issue. If you fail to increment it, then even though your changes are saved, the server will disregard them because it'll compare it to the previous serial. It'll say, it's not a new serial. I'm not accepting the changes even though I see them. Okay. And that's just a check. It's like a canary, you know. Are you paying attention? Yeah, right. So good practice, at least in my opinion. This is not like a, it's not a rule of the world or anything, but I've heard it suggested and I adopted it myself that the good practice is to set the serial number to the current date followed by two extra digits. And the reason for that is you'll never run out of numbers, and it's very clear. Like you have a clear idea when was the last time I made a change, you know, and you have about 100 attempts that where you can actually make changes during that day if you need to. So if you're doing a lot of testing, you got a little bit of room, right? If I have to test things more than 100 times in a day, I probably need a break, So I just do year, month, day, and then 0, 1 or 0, 0, right? And then if I make a change, I increment. Okay, so here's an example of db.mailbuddy.com. It's just the one that I provided. You notice that you have your name server entry, your start of authority, right? With a little bit of information about, you've got your serial number, you've got when certain expiries occur in terms of caching information. How long is this information good for? So if I give a response to a query, I'm telling the clients, this is how long you can trust this information in your cache before you should come back and ask me again. Okay. So we've got an NS name server entry, which is just telling us where the name server is. Oops. And then we've got a couple of A records pointing to the same thing. So NS1 and mail, they're both pointing to the same IP address. NS1 was done for us, if I remember correctly, and mail I had to create myself, right? And then I also create an MX record, which just says, you got to go to the mail host if you want to get mail from this domain. Okay, and so what happens is an MX query will produce this, which you can do a record resolution, which will tell you what the IP address is. Okay. Now, none of that means anything if nobody queries the server, you know? So in Linux, we're just querying ourselves. We're not really doing any extended querying from outside systems. But on the internal LAN, we are doing that a lot. A lot of clients are going to be getting information from our DNS server. Okay. Now here after you've actually made a zone, db.mailbuddy.com, that doesn't mean that it's actually being used yet. You have to register it in named.conf.default zones. Okay, so you just create an extra entry here. You specify the file, okay? And then you reload the service and it'll come across this. It'll say, oh, I got to consult this file. Then it'll import that file, make sure that everything makes sense. And if it does make sense, then it'll work. If you restart the service and you still don't get to resolve, there's probably a problem here, or there's a problem in the sense that you didn't create this entry. Okay. Okay, another thing is etc bind named.conf.options. This is where we configure our forwarders. One thing to watch out for is whether you've removed the comments. Okay. If you haven't removed the comments, then none of this is going to apply, right? So you can change the numbers, but if the comments are still there, it's invisible to the system. Okay. So here we're setting it to 8.8.8.8. Later, we point it to Edgeron. Okay. So in the initial testing, this is just to see, can I get resolution to work, basically, you know? And then we go and we get a little more medieval. Okay, so typically you edit the files needed with a text editor like Nano or VI, save the changes, reload the bind service. Editing the DB mail buddy file allows you to make changes to that zone, which is what we did. Editing named.conf allows you to add a new zone. Editing options allows you to change the global server and how it behaves. Okay, so it's not just forwarders, although that's what we focus on. You may have an issue with DNSSEC. So if you have any kind of encrypted DNS, that may be something you have to either enable or disable. Like for example, if you're working from home and your upstream servers are using DNSSEC, that can also throw a monkey wrench into things. So something to watch out for if you're having that problem. It's a relatively easy fix, but you'll have to Google a bit. After the changes are saved, you run sudo system control, reload the bind service, and then it should pick up the changes, right? But don't forget that serial number. If you don't do that, it's going to ignore you. Now, this is something to do with Edgeron here, and we're dealing with kind of a split mind or a split brain kind of environment here. Because in Edgeron, the DNS server is also a DNS client. That's always the case. But in Edgeron, they're not on the same page, you know? So if you look at your DC, its DNS client information is 127.0.0.1. So it's saying, go to myself, go to my own DNS. And then the DNS service, has all the information. And so the client side and the server side are well integrated. Okay. With Edgeron, we're not doing that. We're actually keeping them separate. And so there is a DNS service running on Edgeron, but the DNS client that Edgeron is using, like its client service, is not consulting it, right? It's going to be using your DC to get its information. So it's serving out information to other people, but it's not using that information for its own purposes. Okay. So we're creating a kind of a semicircular loop here, but it's not quite a loop. If it was a loop, we'd have a problem. But this is just the client is going to query the DC. The DC is going to have the Edgeron server service as a forwarder, and that's when the information on Edgeron comes in. So what this does is it allows the Edgeron client to resolve DNS names within the local LAN, okay? And anytime it's trying to deal with the edgeron.com domain, it's just going to deal with that internal stuff, okay? And the information that's loaded up on the Edgeron DNS service, it never queries, okay? Because anytime I do an Enron query, the DC thinks that it's responsible for it. It won't forward that on to the Edgeron DNS service, okay? However, if Edgeron needs to resolve MailBuddy, for example, it's not going to consult as a client. It's not going to consult its own DNS. It's going to go to the DC. The DC is going to go like, I don't know, MailBuddy. And then it's going to go to its forwarder, which is the Edgeron service. Okay. And then it's going to get an answer. So, like I said, split brain. Okay. Let's see. So, here we're just on Edgeron itself. No, is this? No, this is the D. Well, hold on a second. No, this is Edgeron. Yeah. So Edgeron itself is going to be using the DC to resolve everything. And, anytime there's a mail buddy request, it's going to go to the Edgeron DNS service, but it has to go through the DC to do it. Okay. Anytime it's doing an external request, it's going to eventually consult 192.168.202.2 or 8.8.8.8, okay? But to get there, it has to still go through the DNS service, okay? The DC's DNS service. Um, on the other hand, if it's doing any kind of Enron queries, it never gets past this server. It's like it's by short-circuited, right? It'll answer all the queries for us. Now, on the Linux side, what about Linux clients? That's where this 127.0.0.53 comes in. Okay. So if you go to etcresolve.conf, you can see that entry there. Okay. And that is a caching proxy server. It's really just meant for client services. Um, but basically, it just prevents constant lookups to the outside world, right? Now, this can get in your way a little bit. So we do go and we go to etc systemd resolved.conf. We edit an entry in there and we tell 127.0.0.53 what its next domain server should be. Okay. And so we set it to 192.168.202.15 so that it won't go out to root servers or 8.8.8.8 for any kind of request. It'll first go directly to our bind service. Okay. That's not the default behavior. We have to change that, right? We have to make it do that. So editing etcresolve.conf, you can do it, but it won't persist past a reboot. And you'll see some comments in there in that file where they're like, don't change this, right? You can change it in a pinch, and once you reboot, it'll disappear. Okay. You can also get rid of the proxy server. I don't usually do that because I like to, I like to make everything work smoothly the way it's supposed to work in the first place. Not that I'm a fan of the caching proxy server, but it is there. So you could do either. I don't really care. But just so you understand, this can get in the way and confuse things a little bit unless you make those changes to resolved.conf. Okay. So here's etcresolve.conf. Here's that value. And they're just like, this file is managed. Don't edit it. Yeah, you could violate that. Just when you reboot, it's going to overwrite it anyways. Here's resolved.conf, where we set our name server to 192.168.202.15. This is important, and also watch out for comments. Okay, if there's a hashtag in front, then whatever value you change is not going to be picked up, right? Okay, so which server is authoritative for enron.com, the DC or the Edge server? There's not a real answer to that. They're both fake, right? So the only answer to it is whichever one you're querying directly. That's the one that's going to be authoritative. So functionally, each server thinks it's authoritative. And so the DC is authoritative for itself and all of its clients, all of its domain join clients, and anybody who queries it, right? The Edge server will also see the DC as authoritative from the client side, okay? So as a DNS client. But the DNS service on the Edge server thinks that it's authoritative. And the MailBuddy bind service will be authoritative for MailBuddy. However, for Enron, it'll go to EdgeRon as its forwarder, right? Okay, so getting weird. The DNS service on the Edge server will be authoritative for both MailBuddy.com and Enron.com against each other. So, if anybody queries EdgeRon about MailBuddy, it will decide that it has the answer. If anybody queries EdgeRon about Enron, it will decide that it has the answer. Okay. So the fact that we're using MailBuddy and the DC and we're using as a forwarder EdgeRon means that when the DC queries MailBuddy, it'll get an answer from EdgeRon. And when MailBuddy queries Enron, it'll get an answer from EdgeRon, who thinks it's authoritative. Okay. Now, since the DC thinks it is authoritative for Enron, if I get a query for Enron, it's not gonna pass it on to EdgeRon to get an answer. It's just gonna say, "I got this. Hold my beer," right? Since the MailBuddy server thinks it's authoritative for MailBuddy, it also will not forward it on, and it'll just answer the question. Okay. And the Edge server itself doesn't query itself, right? It queries the DC. So that it feels a little circular, but we can see how it's not because of that split brain on EdgeRon. Okay. So the DNS service on the Edge server, it's got to control two zones, enron.com, mailbuddy.com. Each zone needs an A record that points to the IP address of each server. Okay, so that would be the external facing IPs, sort of. In our case, hold on. Da, da, da. Okay, there's a mistake here. So each zone needs an A record that points to the IP address of each server. Um, yeah, okay. So it should be MailBuddy and Edgeron, right? Is that right? Hold on. Let me think about that. It's an A record. Oh no, it does need to resolve both of these. Yeah, that's correct. It does need MailBuddy and the DC just to be able to reach them. So it needs those IP addresses in there, essentially. Each zone also needs an MX mail exchange record to tell SMTP servers where to go for the domain. So by making the edge roll server the forwarder for the other two servers, we direct mail and we short circuit the outside world for those queries. Okay. The Edge DNS service, so the Edge roll DNS service, will use external DNS servers as forwarders, and that gives us our outside resolution. Okay. Now, testing. NSLOOKUP is your friend here, whether it's on Linux or Windows. Okay. And it does matter which one you're querying from because, there's different firewalls, there's different hierarchies involved. So just the fact that one side resolves correctly doesn't mean that the other side will, you know. Ping can be handy also just to check certain resolution. Um, it's not necessary. NSLOOKUP can do it all, but sometimes ping is a little easier. On the other hand, NSLOOKUP can be used to query any DNS server directly, and that's the nice thing. Okay, so that's kind of what I want to show a little bit. And it can do more exotic queries like MX records, which we want to verify, pointer records, which don't matter quite as much, and then dropping into interactive mode. I've shown that a little bit. So if you just type NSLOOKUP, that drops you into interactive. If you type question mark, that gives you a whole bunch of options, right? And type or query type is really what we're looking for most of the time. Okay. There's some exotic stuff like non-recursive requests and things like that. We're not really going to get into those. We're focused a bit more on the DNS side. Sorry, the mail side, so MX queries, but there's a lot you can do here. So here's an example of an NSLOOKUP, and here we're on Edgeron. Oh, no, we're not. We are on the DC. So NSLOOKUP mail.mailbuddy.com. The server answering is localhost 127.0.0.1. Okay. And the non-authoritative answer is correct. Now, what does that mean when it's saying it's non-authoritative? The DC does not see itself as authoritative for MailBuddy. So it's saying, I got the answer for you, but I'm not the boss of this domain. Okay. So I went and I fetched the answer, but it's mileage may vary kind of thing. This was the details I got. If I did this on Edgeron, Edgeron would decide that it was authoritative. Okay. So it wouldn't say non-authoritative, it would just give me the answer. So here's another interactive one where I do NSLOOKUP. I drop into interactive, I set the type to an MX query, and then I don't query mail.mailbuddy.com. I do the domain mailbuddy.com, right? Because I'm not interested in the single host resolution. I'm interested in where do I go to deliver mail. I get back the answer from localhost, again, non-authoritative because we're on the DC, and it comes back with a correct answer. So these are the things I want to check, right? If I'm not getting back correct answers or it's incomplete, I may need to add some information on one of the servers. Okay. Now it's exactly the same thing when you're on Linux. Okay. Let's okay, so I'm on Edgeron here. Oh, I got my mail server too I need. Excuse me. Let me just freshen that puppy up. Okay, so I'll just look at what I was actually typing already. Yeah, there's no point typing it out again. Let's see what I got here. So here I go into NSLOOKUP. I'm setting the type to MX and I'm checking out the enron.com domain. The server I'm getting back as a reply is that caching proxy. Okay. Now, I could bypass that server, but I do want the whole hierarchy to work because I want my clients to resolve things correctly, right? So when I get back an answer from it, it is giving me the correct answer, but it should be non-authoritative because 127.0053 is a caching server. It's never authoritative, right? Same thing with mailbuddy.com. It should give me a non-authoritative answer because the authority is actually 202.15, right? So even though that's on the same server, it's not the same service, right? Now, let's just check here. Here I just do a type A request. So I set it back to type A. I do edron.enron.com. I come back with a non-authoritative answer because, again, this is caching. And it tells me 201.25, which is correct. So that's part of my testing, right? If any of this came back wrong, I would need to go and look at things and see where the failure is occurring. Okay. Mail.mailbuddy.com. Boo, boo, boo. What's going on there? Oh, it does give me an unauthoritative answer. Oh yeah, because I did a typo. So that's something else to watch out for too if you make a mistake typing. But it resolves correctly in the end. Now, if I don't want to do that, I certainly don't want to do updates. So let's say remind me later. If I just, if I want to say I want to bypass this 127.0053, then instead of going into NSLOOKUP, I can do space dash space, and I could say I want to talk directly to the Big Daddy 168.202.15. Here I'm saying I don't want to go to my primary DNS, which is 127.0053. I want to go to this specific server and I want to talk to it directly. Okay. Once I do that, I can set type equal MX, right? And I can say mailbuddy.com. Okay. Now you notice the difference here. It's no longer saying non-authoritative answer. It's just saying, here you go. I'm in charge of mail.mailbuddy.com or mailbuddy.com. This is your answer. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if I type enron.com, what's going on there? Oh, yeah, it gives a non-authoritative answer, which is correct. And then it's saying authoritative answers can be found from blah, 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 blah. We're not going there, right? So it's aware that there's an outside world. It's getting an answer, but it's not actually gonna consult them, right? It's gonna just go to its next forwarder. It got the answer for us. It doesn't ask any more questions, right? So if you do get something like this, it's so long as the information is correct, that's okay, right? All it's doing here is pointing out the root servers that it can go to. If I do something like google.com, what I should get back is, well, this looks right. I'll assume it is, right? This is actually going out to the outside world. It's giving me a non-authoritative answer because it doesn't control google.com, right? But this is where I should go to send mail, okay? And now notice that's different from gmail.com, which will have probably a lot more entries. Yeah. Okay. So Google probably has their own internal mail system for their own staff. And then there's Gmail, which they handle for a heck of a lot of people, right? If we flip over to Edron, it's the same basic idea. Okay, so I'll just go to a regular PowerShell here because we're just doing NSLOOKUP. Make that a little bigger. Okay, so NSLOOKUP. And if I just do mail.mailbuddy.com, right? Well, it talks to mat.enron.com, so that's my DC. That makes sense. That's the way the configuration should be. And non-authoritative answer, because Matt doesn't control that domain. Mail.mailbuddy.com, 202.15. So it's using its forwarder. It's telling me that it's using its forwarder when it's giving me a non-authoritative answer, which means that the Edgeron service, DNS service, is answering this query for me. Okay. If I want to, I can say, I don't want to talk to matt.enron.com. I want to talk to 192.168.201.25. Right? Now I'm talking directly to the Edgeron service. Okay. And I can do mail.mailbuddy.com. Okay, now it says server unknown, so it's not resolving the name of the server, but it's accepting the IP address. That's probably because I don't have a reverse pointer entry. Okay, so it can't reverse look up the name. But it has no problem. It doesn't say it's not authoritative. It is authoritative for mailbuddy.com, and here's the answer. Okay, now if I remember if I exit or quit, I think it's exit. Okay, I'm gonna NS lookup, but instead of going there, I'm going to go directly to the bind service on Linux. Okay. So again, it can't reverse look up it, but it does. It's able to talk to it, and I'm just going to type mail.mailbuddy.com. Okay. And again, I'm getting an authoritative answer of 192.168.202.15. So he thinks he's authoritative. He thinks he's authoritative. That's the way it should be. Okay. So notice I'm querying the Linux server now. You can do that for all of the services, right? Now, if I try and do something like, let me just exit out of that. If I try and go to 172.24.199.25, what's going to happen here? Anybody? I know you've probably started like drifting off. You're like Homer Simpson driving down the highway, falling asleep. But what's going to happen if from the Linux server I try and NS lookup 172.24.199.25? We're almost done. You'll get an on-off answer. You will get nothing. You won't get an answer, right? Because if I do mailbuddy.com, the firewall should block this. I can't talk directly to that DNS server, right? So we'll just get a timeout here. Okay. So you can actually test connectivity issues as well. If you're trying to talk to a server that you should be able to talk to and you're getting something like that, firewall issue, right? Or routing issue. That's another possibility. So there's lots of things that can go wrong here. Hopefully I've kind of covered a chunk of them. But a good chunk of time will probably be spent trying to figure out what's working, what's not. If you're lucky, you have a smooth experience. You did everything right, and everything will just function. But if you do have to troubleshoot, that's entirely normal. Okay, there are plenty of little details here. And the way that you figure it out is typically DNS queries. Okay. All right, go have fun. I'm gonna have more coffee. If you have any questions, feel free.